Captain Silas Redbeard McGillicuddy dropped from the rigging above, landing cat-like on the quarterdeck with a grace that belied his barrel-chested frame. At 53, he remained as dangerous as any man who sailed the Caribbean, his red beard braided with shark teeth and his pale green eyes holding the cold intelligence of a born predator. Upon his head sat the crown of Leviathans. Murdoch had heard descriptions of the artifact, but seeing it in person stole his breath. Crafted from what appeared to be black coral and encrusted with pearls the size of hen's eggs, it seemed to writhe with its own life. Tentacle-like projections curved around Redbeard's skull, and at its center pulsed a gem that looked like a captured piece of deep ocean blue-black and filled with moving shadows. "Bartholomew," Redbeard called out, his voice carrying easily over the clash of steel. 10 years I've waited for this moment." "Then you've wasted 10 years, Murdoch replied, advancing up the steps toward his rival. "I should have killed you in Tortuga when I had the chance." "Aye, you should have. But you were always too honorable for your own good." Redbeard's smile was sharp as a shark's. "Tell me, do you know what your precious monkey really is?" Jinx hissed from Murdoch's shoulder, the obsidian amulet flaring brighter. Around the ship, the battle continued to rage, but the two captains focused entirely on each other. "I know enough," Murdoch said carefully. Do you know that he's the last guardian of a civilization that ruled these waters when your ancestors were still painting themselves blue and worshipping trees?" Redbeard's eyes never left Jinx. "Do you know that the artifacts he guards could make their bearer master of every sea in the world? And do you know what happens when someone unworthy tries to claim power they don't understand?" Redbeard's laugh was like breaking glass. "Unworthy? I've spent 15 years researching the old legends, tracking down every scrap of lore about the Trident of Tides. I know more about those artifacts than your family ever did." To prove his point, Redbeard raised one hand toward the sea. The crown pulsed with eldritch light, and immediately the water around both ships began to churn. Dark shapes rose from the depths, creatures that belonged to nightmare rather than nature. Tentacles thick as ship's masts broke the surface, followed by eyes the size of shield bucklers and mouths filled with teeth like broken glass. "Behold the children of the deep," Redbeard cried. "They remember when their kind ruled these waters, before men learned to build boats and dream of conquest. The sea monsters didn't attack. Instead, they formed a living barrier around the two ships, preventing any escape, while their alien intelligence watched the battle unfold." Murdoch realized with growing horror that Redbeard wasn't just using the crown's power, he was communing with entities that had existed long before human civilization. "You're mad," Murdoch said. "Those things will turn on you the moment they get the chance. Will they, or will they thank me for giving them the means to reclaim what was stolen from them?" Redbeard drew his own sword, a curved blade that seemed to drink light. "The old world is coming back, Bartholomew. The question is whether you'll be part of it, or feed the fishes." Their swords met in a shower of sparks, and Murdoch quickly realized that his opponent had changed since their last encounter. Redbeard moved with unnatural speed and strength, his strikes carrying power that should have been impossible for a man of his size. The crown wasn't just allowing him to control sea creatures, it was enhancing his physical abilities as well. But Murdoch had advantages of his own. The obsidian amulet around Jinx's neck had begun resonating with some deeper power, and he found his own movements becoming more fluid, his reflexes sharpening beyond human limits. The monkey chattered constant warnings, pointing out openings in Redbeard's defense that Murdoch wouldn't have noticed on his own. Around them, the battle between their crews continued with desperate intensity. Murdoch's men fought like demons, but they were outnumbered and exhausted from the previous night's mutiny. Slowly, inevitably, they were being pushed back. "Your crew fights well," Redbeard panted, as their blades locked at the hilts. "But they're fighting for mere gold. My men fight for a place in the New World Order. Your men fight for a madman who's making bargains with devils." "Devils?" Redbeard's laugh was genuinely amused. "These creatures aren't devils, you fool. They're gods who ruled the earth when it was young, and who will rule it again when the old barriers fall. He broke their blade lock with a surge of supernatural strength, driving Murdoch backward. The giant captain stumbled, his foot slipping on blood-slicked planking, and Redbeard's sword point flicked toward his throat. But Jinx was faster. The monkey launched himself from Murdoch's shoulder directly at Redbeard's face, tiny claws extended and the obsidian amulet blazing with black fire. The artifact's energy struck the crown of Leviathans, and both relics screamed, an actual sound that drove every man on both ships to their knees in agony. In that moment of supernatural conflict, something else happened. The skull-shaped goblet that Redbeard wore at his belt, a drinking cup carved from the skull of his first victim, cracked down its center. As it broke, a hidden compartment was revealed, containing a small scroll wrapped in oiled leather. Murdoch's enhanced reflexes, guided by the amulet's power, allowed him to snatch the scroll, even as Redbeard staggered backward, clutching at his head where Jinx's claws had raked bloody furrows. "What have you done?" Redbeard screamed, but his voice had changed. Instead of one man speaking, it sounded like dozens of voices, speaking in unison, human voices mixed with sounds that belonged to no terrestrial throat. Murdoch unrolled the scroll with one hand, while keeping his sword ready with the other. What he saw there made his blood turn to ice water. It was a map, but not of any Caribbean he knew. This showed the islands as they would be after the Great Rising, a catastrophic event that would reshape the entire region according to coordinates marked in what looked suspiciously like blood. At the bottom of the map, in Redbeard's own handwriting, was a date exactly 7 days from today. "You're not just planning to find the treasure," Murdoch realized. "You're planning to use it to transform the entire Caribbean." Redbeard's smile revealed teeth that were no longer entirely human. "The Trident of Tides doesn't just control water, you ignorant savage. It controls the very forces that shape the earth itself. 7 days from now, when the stars align properly, I'll use it to wake the old ones from their prison beneath the sea floor. And what happens to everyone who lives here now? They adapt, serve, or die. The choice is there." The obsidian amulet pulsed one final time, and Jinx chattered a message that chilled Murdoch's soul. 7 days to stop him, 7 days to save the world. The sea battle ended, as abruptly as it had begun. Redbeard, still reeling from Jinx's attack and the revelation of his hidden plans, called retreat with a gesture that sent the nightmare creatures of the deep sliding back beneath the waves. His boarding party fought a savage rearguard action as they returned to their boats, leaving a dozen dead behind, but taking twice as many of Murdoch's crew with them. As the Devil's Mistress pulled away to a safe distance, Murdoch stood among the carnage of his deck, studying the captured map, while Jinx tended to scratches on his tiny arms. The monkey's brave attack had cost him several of Redbeard's claw marks, had drawn blood, and the obsidian amulet around his neck had dimmed to barely more than a coal's glow. 7 days, Murdoch muttered, rolling up the apocalyptic chart. 7 days to find the trident before he uses it to wake things that should stay sleeping. But even as he spoke, his gaze was drawn to his ship's figurehead. The serpent's remaining ruby eye seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and something about the carved wood itself looked different in the aftermath of the supernatural battle. Where before it had been simple mahogany, now it appeared to have veins of some darker material running through it, veins that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Jinx chittered weakly and pointed at the figurehead with one bandaged paw. Following the monkey's gesture, Murdoch noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The serpent's mouth, which had always been carved in a closed position, now gaped open slightly, and within that opening, something glowed with the deep red light of forge-heated iron. "Get me a boat," Murdoch ordered his quartermaster. "I need to examine the figurehead from the water." Minutes later, Murdoch found himself rowing around his own ship's bow, while Jinx perched anxiously in the stern. Up close, the changes to the figurehead were even more dramatic. The serpent's scales had taken on an almost metallic sheen, and its eyes, both the empty socket and the remaining ruby, tracked his movement with unsettling awareness. But it was what rested inside the serpent's mouth that truly amazed him. There, nestled within the carved wooden fangs like an egg in a nest, sat a conch shell unlike anything Murdoch had ever seen. It was massive, easily 2 feet long, and carved from what appeared to be a single piece of storm-dark coral. Its surface was covered with the same ancient symbols that adorned Jinx's collar, and from its depths came a low, rhythmic sound like distant thunder. The storm collar's conch, the second of the 3 sacred artifacts. "How long has it been there?" Murdoch asked Jinx, who responded with a complex series of taps that translated to always hidden, waiting for danger. Murdoch reached out cautiously to touch the conch, and the moment his fingers made contact, visions flooded his mind. He saw the Caribbean as it had existed in an age when magic flowed as freely as water, when storms could be summoned with a word and calmed with a gesture. He witnessed the great cataclysm that had driven the old ones beneath the waves, sealing them away with artifacts of power that were then scattered and hidden. But more importantly, he saw how to use the conch. The knowledge came not as words or images, but as instinctive understanding burned directly into his consciousness. The storm collar's conch could indeed summon tempests from clear skies, but its true power lay in its ability to command the very forces that drove weather across the ocean. In the right hands, it could turn hurricanes aside, calm tsunamis, or create barriers of wind and water that no ship could penetrate. The figurehead has been carrying it all along, Murdoch realized. That's why my ship has weathered so many storms that should have destroyed us. The conch has been protecting us. Jinx nodded emphatically, then pointed back toward the distant shape of Redbeard's ship. The Devil's Mistress had stopped just beyond cannon range, her rival captain apparently content to shadow the Crimson Leviathan rather than risk another direct confrontation. But Murdoch could see something else, dark shapes moving beneath the water around Redbeard's vessel. The crown of Leviathans was still active, still calling creatures from the depths to serve its wearer's will. If anything, there seemed to be more of them now, as if the brief battle had attracted additional monsters to Redbeard's cause. "He's gathering an army," Murdoch said grimly, "and he knows we have 2 of the 3 artifacts now." As if summoned by his words, Redbeard's voice carried across the water with supernatural clarity, an effect of the crown's power, no doubt. "Bartholomew, I know you found the conch, but it won't save you. I have the location of the Trident's resting place, and in 6 days the stars will align for the great rising. Join me now, and I'll let you live to serve in the New World Order." Murdoch's response was to lift the storm collar's conch from its resting place within the figurehead's mouth. The shell was warm to the touch and thrummed with barely contained energy. When he held it to his lips and blew a single experimental note, the sound that emerged was like the voice of the hurricane itself. Dark clouds immediately began gathering on the horizon, and the wind shifted to carry the scent of rain and lightning. But more importantly, the sea creatures surrounding Redbeard's ship suddenly dove deep, fleeing from a power that predated even their ancient lineage. "I have a better idea," Murdoch shouted back. "Surrender now, and I'll kill you quickly instead of feeding you to the things you're too stupid to properly control." Redbeard's laughter carried across the water like the cry of a madman. "You think you understand what you're dealing with? The conch is nothing compared to the crown. Watch and learn." The rival captain raised his arms toward the darkening sky, and the crown of Leviathans blazed with bioluminescent fire. Instead of calling more sea creatures, this time he reached out to something far more dangerous. The ocean itself began to rise in response to his will, forming waterspouts that danced around his ship like living things. But where Redbeard's power felt chaotic and dangerous, barely controlled, the storm collar's conch offered something different. When Murdoch blew another note, the gathering storm responded not with mindless fury, but with purposeful intent. The winds organized themselves into protective barriers, and the lightning that began to flash held patterns that spoke of intelligence rather than random chance. The artifacts choose their masters, Murdoch realized. Redbeard may have claimed the crown, but it's fighting his control. The conch recognizes me because my family has been its guardian for generations. Jinx chattered agreement, then pointed urgently toward the map still tucked in Murdoch's coat. The monkey's message was clear. They had the tools to fight Redbeard now, but they still needed to reach the Trident's location before their enemy could complete his apocalyptic ritual. 6 days, Murdoch said, studying the captured chart while supernatural storms gathered around both ships. 6 days to cross the Caribbean, find an island that may not even exist on any normal map, and claim a weapon that could reshape the world. She looked at Jinx, who despite his injuries was already pointing toward the bearing indicated by the eye of the serpent and the corrected compass. "Well then," Murdoch said, raising the conch to his lips once more, "let's see how fast this old ship can sail when she has the storm itself filling her sails." The note that emerged from the conch this time was deeper, more complex, a harmony of wind and wave that seemed to awaken something primal in the crimson Leviathan's timbers. The ship leaped forward like a living thing, her sails billowing with winds that blew from no earthly direction, carrying her toward a destiny that would determine the fate of every soul in the Caribbean. The speaking stone revealed itself during the third night of their supernatural pursuit across the Caribbean. Murdoch had been pushing the Crimson Leviathan beyond all reasonable limits, using the Stormcaller's conch to summon winds that drove his ship faster than any vessel had a right to sail. Behind them, Redbeard's fleet, for he had summoned allies from across the pirate brotherhood, followed like a pack of hungry wolves, their ships propelled by creatures of the deep and unnatural currents. Jinx had grown increasingly agitated as they sailed deeper into waters that appeared on no chart. The monkey's injuries from his battle with Redbeard were healing with supernatural speed, aided by the obsidian amulet's power, but something else was changing in him. His movements had become more purposeful, his chittering more complex, and his eyes held depths that seemed older than the sea itself. It was during Murdoch's watch, as lightning from the storm-summoned clouds illuminated their path, that Jinx began to behave in a way the captain had never witnessed before. The monkey climbed down from his usual perch and made his way to a canvas-covered crate that had been secured in the ship's hold for as long as Murdoch could remember. A piece of cargo so old and unremarkable that even he had forgotten its origins. With movements that suggested reverence rather than curiosity, Jinx pulled away the canvas to reveal a stone unlike anything in Murdoch's experience. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a man's head, and carved from what appeared to be black jade, shot through with veins of silver. The surface was covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, creating patterns that hurt the mind to follow. The moment the covering was removed, the stone began to emit a low humming sound that resonated through the ship's timber. More disturbing still, it began to glow with the same pale light that emanated from Jinx's collar, as if the two artifacts were communicating across the ages. "What is that thing?" Murdoch asked, approaching the stone with the caution he normally reserved for loaded cannon. Jinx looked up at him, and for the first time in 10 years of companionship, the monkey spoke. Not chittering or chattering, but actual words in perfectly clear English, delivered in a voice that sounded ancient beyond measure, despite coming from such a small throat. "This is the speaking stone of Atlantica, Captain Murdoch. It is the repository of my people's accumulated wisdom and the key to understanding what you face in the days ahead." Murdoch staggered backward, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword before reason reminded him that Jinx, whatever Jinx truly was, had never shown him anything but loyalty. "You can speak," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have always been able to speak." But the stone's proximity was required to give voice to thoughts too complex for simple gestures. Jinx's new voice carried weight and sadness that spoke of centuries of accumulated loss. "I am not what you have believed me to be, Captain. I am the last guardian of a civilization that ruled these waters, when your ancestors had not yet learned to build boats." The speaking stone pulsed brighter, and suddenly Murdoch could see visions within its crystalline depths. He witnessed a Caribbean that bore little resemblance to the waters he knew, a place where islands floated in the sky, where ships sailed beneath the waves as easily as upon them, and where beings of impossible beauty and power commanded the very forces of nature. My people called themselves the Atlanticans, though history has garbled our name into legends of Atlantis. We were not gods, despite what the artifact's power might suggest, but we had learned to work in harmony with forces that your kind considers supernatural. What happened to them? Murdoch asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be tragic. We grew proud. We believed our mastery of the ocean's power made us invincible. We began experimenting with forces that should have remained untouched, the same forces that your enemy Redbeard now seeks to awaken. The stone's glow intensified, showing visions of a great catastrophe. The Old Ones are not gods, Captain. Though they are older than any civilization, they are parasites from the spaces between stars, beings that feed on chaos and destruction. My people thought to bargain with them, to use their power for our own purposes. The visions in the stone showed cities being consumed by darkness, great temples cracking as tentacled horrors emerged from dimensional rifts, and proud Atlantican ships being dragged beneath waves that burned with otherworldly fire. The bargain failed, Jinx continued. The Old Ones would have consumed our entire world if my people had not made the ultimate sacrifice. Using the 3 sacred artifacts, the Storm Collar's conch, the Crown of Leviathans, and the Eye of the Serpent, they managed to seal the Old Ones away in dimensions adjacent to our own. But the effort required destroying our entire civilization to provide the necessary energy, and you survived how? I was chosen to be the Guardian, transformed by the artifact's power into a form that could endure through the centuries. My task was to ensure that the barriers holding the Old Ones remained intact, and to guide any who might be worthy when the artifacts inevitably surfaced again. Murdoch felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. That's why you've been with my family. We're the Guardians you chose. Your bloodline carries the resonance necessary to properly wield the artifacts without being consumed by their power. But even so, the temptation will be enormous. The Crown of Leviathans has already begun corrupting Redbeard, making him believe he can control forces that exist only to consume and destroy. The Speaking Stone's visions shifted to show Redbeard's current position, still pursuing them but now accompanied by a fleet of over 20 ships. Some flew the colors of notorious pirate captains, but others bore no flags at all, vessels crewed by things that had once been human but were now something far worse. He's promised them power in the new world he plans to create, Jinx explained, but the Old Ones do not share power, they only consume. If Redbeard succeeds in his ritual, every living thing in the Caribbean will be transformed into servants of chaos. And from there the corruption will spread across the entire world. The Trident of Tides, can it really give someone that kind of power? The Trident is not a weapon in any conventional sense. It is a key that can unlock the dimensional barriers, holding the Old Ones in their prison. In the right hands, it could reinforce those barriers for another 1,000 years. In the wrong hand, the stone showed visions of tentacled monstrosities emerging from the ocean depths, of islands being consumed by writhing darkness, of the very stars going out one by one as cosmic parasites fed on the light itself. How do we stop him? Murdoch asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. You must reach the Trident's resting place before he does, and you must be prepared to make the same sacrifice my people made, if necessary. The artifacts can only be safely used by one willing to give up everything for the sake of others, and if I'm not willing, Jinx's ancient eyes held infinite compassion. Then the world ends, Captain, and everything you have ever cared about becomes food for entities that exist only to devour hope itself. The Speaking Stone's glow began to fade, but not before showing one final vision, a small island that existed in the exact center of the Caribbean, visible only when all 3 artifacts were brought together during a specific astronomical alignment. 3 days remain, Jinx said, his voice already returning to its normal monkey chatter as the stone's power waned. 3 days to reach the Nexus Isle and claim the trident before Redbeard can complete his ritual. Murdoch looked out at the storm-lashed sea ahead, knowing that somewhere in those dark waters lay either salvation or damnation for every soul in the Caribbean. The speaking stone had given him knowledge, but knowledge without the courage to act was worthless. "Then we'd better sail faster," he said, raising the storm color's conch to his lips once more. The final approach to Nexus Isle required more than courage. It demanded a fundamental understanding of powers that predated human civilization. As the Crimson Leviathan sailed through waters that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, Murdoch found himself relying on an artifact he had never fully appreciated. His father's broken compass, now revealed to be far more sophisticated than any navigational instrument ever created by mortal hands. With the Eye of the Serpent providing illumination and the storm color's conch controlling the supernatural winds that propelled them forward, the compass had transformed from a seemingly useless relic into the most crucial tool aboard the ship. Its needle no longer spun wildly. Instead, it traced complex geometric patterns that corresponded to the dimensional shifts required to reach the trident's resting place. "It's not really a compass at all," Murdoch realized, watching the needle trace what appeared to be a map of folded space-time. "It's a dimensional calculator." Jinx, who had remained mostly silent since the speaking stone had allowed him to reveal his true nature, chittered in agreement. The monkey's eyes held depths of knowledge that made Murdoch acutely aware of just how much his companion had been concealing over their years together. Behind them, Redbeard's fleet had grown to over 30 ships, but the pursuit had become increasingly difficult as they sailed deeper into waters that followed no earthly laws. Several of the rival captains' vessels had simply vanished when their crews proved unable to navigate the dimensional shifts, consumed by spatial anomalies that left no trace behind. "He's losing ships," Murdoch observed, watching through his spyglass as another of Redbeard's allied vessels folded in on itself and disappeared. "The crown is powerful, but it's not designed for this kind of navigation." But even as he spoke, he could see that Redbeard himself was adapting. The Devil's Mistress sailed through the impossible waters with increasing confidence, as if her captain was learning to read the dimensional currents by trial and error. More disturbing still, the creatures of the deep that followed in his wake were growing larger and more alien with each passing hour. The compass needle suddenly locked into a new pattern, a perfect spiral that seemed to draw the eye into its center. Immediately, the sea around the Crimson Leviathan began to change. The water took on an opalescent quality, reflecting colors that had no names, and the horizon curved in ways that made Murdoch's head ache to contemplate. "We're entering the final approach," he announced to his crew, many of whom had already noticed that the stars above no longer formed familiar constellations. "Whatever happens next, remember that we're not just fighting for treasure. We're fighting for the right of every living thing to continue existing." The compass patterns grew more complex as they sailed deeper into dimensional space that existed alongside but separate from the normal Caribbean. Murdoch found himself making navigational corrections that defied logic, turning left to go right, sailing uphill across level water, following currents that flowed in directions that geometry insisted were impossible. But the most unsettling change was in the compass itself. As they drew closer to their destination, the artifact began to warm in Murdoch's hands, and he could feel a presence within it, not malevolent, but ancient beyond human comprehension. It was as if the compass contained the ghost, its original creator, guiding them toward a confrontation that had been planned centuries ago. "Father," Murdoch whispered, understanding finally dawning. "You didn't die searching for treasure. You died trying to reach this place, trying to prevent someone else from claiming the trident." The compass grew warmer still, and for just a moment, Murdoch could have sworn he heard his father's voice carried on the supernatural winds. "The bloodline remembers, son. Trust the compass. Trust the monkey. Trust yourself." Ahead of them, reality began to reassert itself as they approached the coordinates indicated by the compass patterns. The opalescent water gradually returned to normal blue, the impossible horizon straightened, and the alien stars faded to reveal the familiar Caribbean sky. But in the center of this returned normality sat an island that should not have existed. Nexus Isle rose from the sea like a dream made manifest. Its beaches were black volcanic sand that sparkled with flecks of what might have been diamonds or crystallized starlight. Ancient temples carved from single pieces of coral rose in perfect geometric harmony, their surfaces covered with the same symbols that adorned Jinx's collar and the speaking stone. At the island's heart, a pyramid of impossible proportions reached toward the sky, its apex wreathed in clouds that pulsed with their own bioluminescent light. "The Atlantecan's final stronghold," Jinx said, speaking aloud for the first time since the revelation. "The last place where their civilization made its stand against the old ones." But even as they approached the island's shore, Murdoch could see they were not alone. Redbeard's surviving ships had somehow navigated the dimensional maze as well, and the Devil's Mistress was already launching boats toward the beach. Worse still, the sea around the island was alive with creatures that belonged to no earthly ocean. Things with too many eyes and tentacles that moved with malevolent intelligence. "He's already here," Murdoch said grimly, "and he's brought reinforcements from wherever the old ones are imprisoned." The compass in his hands grew almost too hot to hold, its needle now pointing directly at the pyramid's peak, where something pulsed with the rhythm of a cosmic heartbeat. The Trident of Tides was there, waiting for whoever proved worthy or strong enough to claim it. "Captain," his quartermaster called out, "the men are ready for landing, but those things in the water are not our primary concern," Murdoch finished. He raised the storm collar's conch and blew a single commanding note. The sound that emerged was like the voice of creation itself, and the nightmare creatures surrounding the island dove deep, seeking shelter from a power that predated even their ancient origins. But the reprieve would be temporary. Already Murdoch could see Redbeard's boats reaching the beach, their crews armed not just with conventional weapons, but with artifacts and talismans that glowed with eldritch energy. The rival captain had been busy during their pursuit, gathering relics and allies that would serve him in the final confrontation. "This ends here," Murdoch said, securing the compass in his coat and drawing his sword. "One way or another, this ends on Nexus Isle." Jinx chattered something that might have been agreement or farewell, then pointed toward the pyramid, where destiny waited. The compass grew warmer still, as if sensing that its long journey through generations of Murdoch hands was finally approaching its intended conclusion. Whether that conclusion would be triumph or catastrophe remained to be seen, but as the Crimson Leviathan's boats hit the black sand beach, Murdoch knew there would be no turning back from whatever waited within the ancient pyramid's depths. The crown of Leviathans had transformed Redbeard into something that was no longer entirely human. As the two captains faced each other in the pyramid's apex chamber, surrounded by walls covered in Atlantecan symbols that pulsed with otherworldly light, Murdoch could see that his rival had paid a terrible price for the power he wielded. Redbeard's skin had taken on a grayish, scaled texture that reflected the chamber's eldritch illumination. His eyes burned with bioluminescent fire, and when he smiled, his teeth had become rows of razor-sharp points more suited to a deep-sea predator than a human mouth. Most disturbing of all, tentacle-like appendages now writhed where his red beard had once been, each one ending in a mouth filled with needle teeth. The crown itself had grown to encompass most of Redbeard's skull, its black coral structure extending tendrils that burrowed beneath his skin, like living parasites. The pearls that adorned it pulsed with the same rhythm as his heartbeat, and the central gem contained moving shadows that suggested vast intelligences watching from dimensions beyond human comprehension. "Behold the future of humanity," Redbeard declared, his voice now a harmony of human speech and sounds that belonged to creatures from the deepest ocean trenches. "This is what we become when we stop pretending we are the masters of this world." Between the two captains, suspended in a column of crystallized water that rose from floor to ceiling, hung the Trident of Tides. The weapon, if weapon was the right word, defied easy description. It appeared to be carved from a single piece of coral that contained the fossilized essence of every creature that had ever lived in the sea. Its three prongs were tipped with gems that held captured storms, each one crackling with lightning that had been frozen in time. Along its length, symbols flowed like living script, telling the history of the ocean itself in languages that predated human speech. You see it too, don't you? Redbeard continued, his transformed features twisted in what might have been ecstasy. The trident doesn't just control water, it is water. Every drop in every ocean, every wave that has ever broken on every shore. With it I can remake the world according to patterns older than continents. Murdoch raised the storm collar's conch, its surface warm with power that responded to his will, and destroy everything that makes it worth saving in the process. Worth saving? Redbeard's laughter was like the sound of breaking coral. Look around you, Bartholomew. This pyramid, this island, this entire complex. It's all that remains of a civilization that understood the ocean's true nature. They created wonders that make our greatest achievements look like children's sandcastles, and where are they now? They sacrificed themselves to prevent exactly what you're trying to do. Murdoch replied, feeling Jinx's reassuring weight on his shoulder. They chose extinction over corruption. They chose poorly. I choose evolution. The crown's influence was spreading beyond Redbeard's physical form. The chamber's walls were beginning to weep with moisture that moved against gravity, flowing upward to collect in patterns that hurt the eye to follow. Worse still, Murdoch could hear something scratching at the edges of reality. The old ones, sensing that their prison walls were weakening as the crown's power grew. The barriers are failing, Jinx whispered in his ear, the monkey's voice barely audible above the sound of dimensions grinding against each other. If he claims the trident while wearing the crown, the old ones will have a pathway into this reality. Murdoch understood. Redbeard's plan wasn't just to use the trident's power. It was to serve as a conduit for entities that existed only to consume and corrupt. The crown had already begun that transformation, turning a human pirate into something that could serve as a vessel for cosmic parasites. Last chance, Bartholomew, Redbeard said, extending one hand toward the crystallized column. Join me willingly and I'll let you keep enough of your humanity to remember what it felt like to have a choice. Murdoch's response was to raise the storm collar's conch to his lips and blow a note that shook the pyramid to its foundations. The sound wasn't just music. It was pure will given voice, the accumulated determination of every human who had ever stood against forces beyond their understanding. The note struck the crown of Leviathans like a physical blow, and Redbeard staggered backward with a scream that was echoed by voices from beyond the walls of reality. For a moment the crown's hold on him weakened, and Murdoch could see traces of the man Redbeard had once been struggling to reassert itself. But only for a moment. The crown's response was swift and terrible. Tentacles of living shadow erupted from its coral structure, lashing out at anything within reach. The chamber's walls began to crack, revealing glimpses of spaces between dimensions where things with too many eyes watched the confrontation with hungry anticipation. You cannot stop what has already begun, Redbeard roared, his voice now completely inhuman. The old ones have waited eons for this moment. They will not be denied. He lunged toward the trident's crystallized prison, the crown blazing with power that turned the air itself into something thick and viscous. But Murdoch was ready. Years of combat experience guided his movements as he intercepted his rival's charge, the storm collar's conch clashing against tentacles of living coral in a battle that was as much spiritual as physical. The two artifacts, conch and crown, were never meant to be wielded in direct opposition to each other. Their collision sent shockwaves through reality itself, causing the pyramid to shake, and the crystallized column, holding the trident, to begin developing hairline cracks. If I cannot have it, Redbeard snarled, his transformed features contorting with rage, then no one will. He raised the crown's power not toward claiming the trident, but toward shattering its prison entirely. If the weapon fell uncontrolled into the chamber, its power would flow freely into whatever hands claimed it first. Or more likely, it would create a dimensional rift that would allow the old ones to pour through like a tide of cosmic horror. Murdoch realized with crystal clarity that winning the battle might mean losing everything that mattered. But as the Stormcaller's conch grew warm in his hands and Jinx chittered urgent warnings in his ear, he also understood that some victories required sacrifices that went beyond mere life and death. The crown of Leviathans pulsed with malevolent triumph as its power reached toward the trident's weakening prison, while dimensional barriers strained under pressure from entities that existed only to devour hope itself. The trident of tides broke free from its crystallized prison, with a sound like the birth of hurricanes. As the ancient weapon fell toward the pyramid's floor, reality itself seemed to hold its breath. The old ones pressing against weakening dimensional barriers, cosmic parasites sensing that their moment of release was at hand. But Murdoch was faster. His dive toward the falling trident carried all the desperation of a man who understood that failure meant not just death, but the corruption of everything he had ever valued. His fingers closed around the weapon's coral shaft, just as Redbeard's transformed claws reached for the same prize, and the moment both men touched the artifact simultaneously, the world exploded into chaos. The trident wasn't just a weapon. It was the concentrated essence of every ocean that had ever existed, every storm that had ever raged, every drop of water that had ever fallen as rain or risen as mist. Touching it was like grasping the heartbeat of the planet itself, feeling the pulse of tides that moved not just water, but time, space, and the fundamental forces that held reality together. Murdoch's mind was instantly flooded with visions of the trident's history. He saw the Atlantean masters who had forged it from coral grown in the deepest trenches, fed with the dreams of creatures that had never seen sunlight. He witnessed the great battle where it had been used to seal the old ones away, watching as an entire civilization sacrificed itself to prevent cosmic horror from consuming their world. But he also saw something else, something that the Speaking Stone's revelations had not prepared him for. The trident had a consciousness of its own, ancient and alien but not malevolent. It was the voice of the ocean itself, speaking in currents and tides, in the migration patterns of whales and the spawning cycles of fish. And it was afraid. Afraid of what Redbeard had become. Afraid of the crown's corrupting influence. Afraid that its power would be used not to protect life, but to serve entities that existed only to devour it. Choose, the trident whispered in Murdoch's mind, its voice like waves breaking on distant shores. The crown-bearer seeks to make me a key to unlock what should remain sealed. You must choose, wield me as the Atlanteans did, with full understanding of the price, or let me return to the depths where I can do no more harm. The choice seemed impossible, while using the trident meant accepting responsibility not just for the Caribbean, but for every ocean on Earth. It meant becoming something more and less than human, a guardian whose existence would span centuries and whose decisions would affect the fate of countless species. But not using it meant allowing Redbeard to claim it unopposed. The transformed pirate was still fighting to wrench the weapon from Murdoch's grasp, his coral-encrusted claws leaving bloody furrows on his rival's hand. The crown of Leviathans blazed with power that was slowly overwhelming Redbeard's remaining humanity, turning him into a perfect vessel for the Old One's influence. "You feel it, don't you?" Redbeard snarled, his voice now completely inhuman. "The weight of all that responsibility, the knowledge that using its power will change you into something your crew won't recognize, something your loved ones will fear." He was right, and that made his words all the more terrible. Murdoch could feel the trident's power calling to him, offering mastery over forces that could reshape continents. But he could also feel what that mastery would cost. His humanity, his mortality, his connection to everything that had made life worth living. "Join with me," Redbeard continued, his grip on the trident tightening. "Let the old ones return. They offer a different kind of immortality, one that doesn't require you to carry the ocean's burden alone." For a moment, Murdoch almost considered it. The crown's influence was seductive, promising power without responsibility, strength without sacrifice. It would be so easy to let the cosmic parasites take control, to become part of something larger and hungrier than human ambition. But then Jinx chittered urgently in his ear, and Murdoch remembered something the speaking stone had shown him. In all the visions of Atlantecan civilization, in all the records of their great achievements and terrible sacrifices, there had been one constant. They had chosen to protect life rather than consume it, even when that choice led to their extinction. "No," Murdoch said, his voice carrying across the pyramid chamber, with surprising strength. "Some prices are too high to pay, even for survival." He threw his full weight into wresting the trident away from Redbeard, and the weapon responded to his determination by flaring with power that illuminated the entire chamber. The light wasn't the cold bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures, but the warm radiance of sunlight filtering through shallow water where coral gardens bloomed in impossible colors. The effect on Redbeard was immediate and terrible. The crown of Leviathans, designed to work in harmony with the ocean's darkness, recoiled from the trident's illumination like a vampire from holy water. The coral tentacles that had replaced Redbeard writhed in apparent agony, and his scaled skin began to smoke where the light touched it. "Impossible," he screamed. "The old ones are stronger. They are older. They have waited so long." But even as he spoke, his grip on the trident was weakening. The weapon's consciousness had made its own choice, recognizing in Murdoch not perfection, but the willingness to sacrifice personal desires for something larger than himself. The moment Redbeard's claws lost their hold on the coral shaft, the trident's full power flowed into Murdoch like a tide returning to shore. The sensation was overwhelming. Suddenly he could feel every drop of water in the Caribbean, could sense the movement of creatures in trenches so deep that pressure would crush diamonds, could hear the songs that whales sang in the darkest depths, where no human had ever ventured. But with that power came knowledge that changed everything. The old ones weren't just cosmic parasites, they were a test. A challenge that arose whenever a species grew advanced enough to threaten the fundamental balance between order and chaos. The Atlanteans had faced that test and chosen sacrifice over corruption. Now it was humanity's turn. "The choice is made," Murdoch said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the pyramid's ancient stones. "The ocean remembers what you forgot, Redbeard. Some hungers should never be fed." The trident pulsed in his hands, and suddenly the chamber was filled with water, not flooding destructively, but flowing with the controlled purpose of a tide that knew exactly where it needed to go. The water surrounded Redbeard, supporting him gently even as it began to separate him from the crown of Leviathans. For the first time in months, the corrupted pirate's face showed traces of the man he had once been. Without the crown's influence, his features began returning to human proportions, though the changes would never completely fade. "Bartholomew," he whispered, his voice his own for the first time since putting on the cursed artifact. "What have I done?" 6 months later, the silver collar around Jinx's neck had taken on a different quality. Where once it had been a mystery binding an ancient guardian to his duty, it had become something closer to a badge of honor, the mark of a partnership freely chosen, rather than magically imposed. Captain Bartholomew Murdoch stood at the bow of the Crimson Leviathan, watching the sun set over waters that now responded to his will like an extension of his own body. The Trident of Tides rested in a specially crafted mount beside the ship's wheel, its coral surface pulsing gently with the rhythm of distant tides. To most observers, it appeared to be nothing more than an elaborate decoration, but Murdoch could feel its constant presence in his mind, a whisper of currents and depth that never fully faded. The transformation had not been without cost. His hair had turned completely white in the months since claiming the trident, and his eyes now held flecks of sea green that seemed to shift like sunlight on water. More significantly, he could no longer venture far from the ocean without feeling a physical ache, as if part of his soul remained tethered to the waves. But he was still human, still Murdoch, still the captain of the most unusual crew in Caribbean history. Redbeard, though he had reclaimed his birth name of Silas McGillicuddy, served now as Murdoch's first mate, the corruption of the crown of Leviathan slowly fading from his features as the months passed. The experience had left him humbled and haunted, but also possessing knowledge of the Old Ones that made him invaluable in detecting their attempts to influence the world. "Report," Murdoch said as Silas approached with the evening's intelligence. "3 more incidents this week," the former enemy replied, consulting notes written in his careful script. A merchant vessel reported seeing lights beneath the water near Jamaica that arranged themselves in patterns that made the crew remember things that hadn't happened yet. A fishing boat off the Dominican coast brought up nets full of fish that had been dead for centuries, but showed no signs of decay. And there's been unusual whale song activity near the Puerto Rico Trench, songs in frequencies that don't match any known species. Murdoch nodded grimly. The Old Ones hadn't abandoned their attempts to breach the dimensional barriers. If anything, their efforts had become more sophisticated, more subtle. Instead of trying to force their way through, they were looking for cracks, places where reality was thin enough to allow their influence to seep through gradually. "The collar's been warm all day," Jinx said, speaking aloud as he often did now that the need for secrecy had passed. "Something's building, something larger than isolated incidents." The monkey had changed as well, though in more subtle ways. His speech had become more refined, more distinctly his own rather than an echo of ancient Atlantecan voice. More importantly, he seemed genuinely content for the first time in centuries, no longer bearing the weight of guardianship alone. "The Puerto Rico Trench," Murdoch mused. "That's where the barriers are thinnest, isn't it?" "One of the places," Jinx confirmed. "The Atlanteans built their final fortress there, using the deepest parts of the ocean as natural reinforcement for their dimensional seals. But the seals require maintenance, and it's been over 1,000 years since anyone performed the necessary ritual." This was the reality of Murdoch's new existence. He wasn't just a pirate captain anymore. He was the guardian of barriers that protected reality itself from entities that existed only to consume and corrupt. It was a responsibility that required constant vigilance, constant learning, and constant sacrifice of the simpler life he had once known. But it wasn't a burden he carried alone. His crew had adapted to their captain's transformation with the pragmatic acceptance of men who had seen enough of the world's strangeness to take supernatural responsibility in stride. They understood that their raids now served a purpose beyond mere profit. Every Spanish treasure ship they captured, every rival pirate they defeated, was also an opportunity to search for artifacts that might be used by those seeking to contact the Old Ones. "Set course for Puerto Rico," Murdoch decided. "If something's building, we need to see it firsthand." As the Crimson Leviathan came about, her sails filling with winds that obeyed the Trident's subtle influence, Murdoch reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had begun as a simple pirate, seeking legendary treasure. He had become something far more complex, part human, part force of nature, entirely committed to protecting a world that would never know how close it had come to cosmic horror. The silver collar around Jinx's neck pulsed with gentle warmth as they sailed toward whatever new challenge awaited them in the deep waters, where reality wore thin. It was no longer a chain binding an ancient guardian to eternal duty, but a symbol of partnership between species, between past and present, between the wisdom of ages and the determination of those willing to stand against the dark. Behind them, other ships followed, vessels crewed by pirates who had chosen to join Murdoch's unusual crusade. Former enemies like Silas, treasure hunters drawn by legends of the Trident's power, even a few naval officers who had gradually come to understand that some threats required responses that fell outside official channels. They called themselves the Leviathan Fleet, and while they still lived as pirates in most respects, their true purpose was far more significant than any conventional piracy. They were humanity's first line of defense against forces that most people couldn't even imagine, guardians of barriers that had to hold if civilization was to survive. The silver collar caught the last rays of sunset, its ancient symbols seeming to shift and dance in the golden light. For 10 years it had been a mystery. For 6 months it had been a symbol of transformation. Now, as they sailed toward whatever darkness stirred in the deepest trenches of the Caribbean, it had become something else entirely, a reminder that some bonds transcend species, time, and even the boundaries between dimensions. The conversation between monkey and man that had begun with desperate signals and patient misunderstanding had evolved into something far more profound, a partnership that would endure as long as the ocean itself remembered the price of freedom. The crystal sextant had been waiting for them in the ruins of an ancient Atlantican observatory, hidden beneath centuries of coral growth on a seamount that existed only when the dimensional barriers were thin. Unlike any navigational instrument crafted by human hands, this device was carved from a single piece of crystallized starlight, or at least, that's how it appeared to Murdoch's transformed vision. The artifact pulsed with the same rhythm as distant quasars, its faceted surface capturing and refracting light that had traveled across impossible distances to reach the Caribbean's depths. When Murdoch held it up to peer through its crystal lenses, he could see not just the position of earthly stars, but the alignment of dimensional rifts that connected this reality to the spaces between worlds, where the old ones waited. The Puerto Rico Trench incident was just a test. Murdoch realized watching cosmic coordinates shift across the sextant's display. They're mapping the weak points in our reality's defenses. Jinx perched on his shoulder, the silver collar around his neck resonating with harmonic frequencies that made the crystal sextant's readings clearer. The monkey had been unusually quiet since they'd discovered the observatory, his ancient memories clearly troubled by what the artifact was revealing. 17 breach attempts in the last month, Jinx finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of accumulated knowledge. Each one carefully calculated to test the barrier's response. They're learning how our reality defends itself. The crystal sextant showed more than just dimensional weak points. It revealed the old one's strategy with terrifying clarity. Instead of attempting another massive assault like the one the Atlanticans had defeated, the cosmic parasites were planning something far more insidious. They would open thousands of tiny rifts simultaneously, each too small to trigger the barrier's major defenses, but collectively large enough to allow their influence to seep through like water through a cracked dam. "How long do we have?" Murdoch asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The sextant's crystalline surfaces shifted to show a star chart that bore no resemblance to any constellation visible from Earth. But Murdoch's transformed understanding allowed him to read the alien geometries, to see how the positions of entities that existed outside normal spacetime would align in exactly 43 days. "The convergence of hungry stars," Jinx whispered, using a phrase from the most forbidden Atlantican texts. "When the old one's prison dimensions align with our reality's weakest points, they'll be able to force their way through even the strongest barriers." Murdoch lowered the sextant, his mind racing through the implications. 43 days to identify and strengthen thousands of potential breach points scattered across the world's oceans. It was an impossible task for even the most organized fleet, let alone the collection of reformed pirates and supernatural guardians that made up his current forces. "We need help," he said finally. "More help than the Leviathan fleet can provide." The Atlanticans had contingency plans, Jinx offered hopefully, emergency protocols for exactly this kind of systematic assault. But implementing them would require artifacts that have been lost for centuries. "What kind of artifacts?" The monkey's expression grew troubled, the kind that were deliberately hidden because using them required sacrifices that even my people considered too extreme. Through the crystal sextant, Murdoch could see the old ones stirring in their dimensional prisons, sensing that their moment of release was approaching. The entities moved with purpose that spoke of intelligence vast beyond human comprehension, but also of hunger, so all-consuming that it would devour entire realities without pause. "Show me," Murdoch said, raising the sextant once more. "Show me what the Atlanticans planned for their final contingency." The artifact's response was immediate and overwhelming. Visions flooded Murdoch's mind, images of weapons that could crack the foundation of reality itself, of rituals that required the willing sacrifice of entire bloodlines, of guardians who had chosen to become something beyond both human and divine in order to hold back cosmic horror. At the center of these desperate plans was an artifact that the Atlanticans had hoped never to use, the heart of the maelstrom, a crystalline construct that could either stabilize dimensional barriers across the entire planet or tear them all down simultaneously. It was hidden somewhere in the deepest trenches of the Pacific, guarded by creatures that the Atlanticans had created specifically to prevent its discovery. The heart could work, Jinx admitted reluctantly, but using it would require combining the power of all 3 Caribbean artifacts, with at least 7 others, scattered across the world's oceans. And even then, the energy required would require the life force of every guardian who has ever been chosen by the artifacts. Past, present and future. The heart doesn't just use power, it consumes the very concept of guardianship itself. Murdoch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean winds. The Atlanticans' final contingency wasn't just desperate. It was designed to end the eternal cycle of guardianship by expending everything that made it possible. "There has to be another way," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, the crystal sextant was showing him the mathematical certainty of the Old One's assault. Thousands of beat-rich points, each precisely calculated to overwhelm any defense that didn't draw on power sources beyond conventional guardianship. "Perhaps," Jinx said quietly, "but if there is, we'll need to find it in the next 43 days, while simultaneously preventing smaller incursions from weakening the barriers further." The crystal sextant pulsed with starlight that had traveled from the edge of the universe, its readings showing new breach attempts beginning even as they spoke. The Old Ones weren't waiting for their grand convergence. They were testing defenses, probing for weaknesses, ensuring that when the moment came, their assault would face minimal resistance. Murdoch secured the sextant in his coat, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. The simple pirate who had dismissed his monkey's signals for 10 years was gone forever, replaced by something that existed at the intersection of human determination and oceanic power. "Signal the fleet," he ordered as they prepared to leave the ancient observatory. "We're going to need every ship, every artifact, and every ally we can gather. And send word to the naval authorities in every Caribbean port. They need to know what's coming, whether they believe it or not." The crystal sextant grew warm against his chest as dimensional barriers strained under increasing pressure from entities that had been waiting eons for this opportunity. 43 days to save not just the Caribbean, but every ocean on Earth from corruption that would transform the planet into something unrecognizable. As they sailed away from the seamount, Murdoch caught Jinx, staring back at the ancient observatory with an expression of profound sadness. "What is it?" Murdoch asked. "I was just thinking," the monkey replied softly, "that the Atlanticans built that place to watch for exactly this kind of threat. They saw it coming centuries ago and prepared as best they could. But in the end, preparation wasn't enough. It never is, when you're facing something that exists only to consume hope itself." The bone flute had once belonged to a creature that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously, its hollow chambers carved from calcium deposits that had absorbed the songs of dying stars. Found clutched in the skeletal fingers of an Atlantican musician in the ruins of their greatest temple, the instrument possessed the ability to harmonize with frequencies that normal matter couldn't produce or survive. Margaret O'Malley, the Irish sea witch who had answered Murdoch's desperate call for allies, held the artifact with the reverence of someone who understood both its power and its price. Her weathered hands, marked with scars from decades of practicing forbidden arts, traced the flute's length with professional appreciation. "This'll do," she said, her accent thick with the music of County Cork. "Though playing it properly will likely kill whoever attempts it. The frequencies needed to strengthen dimensional barriers aren't meant for human throats or lungs." Murdoch watched her examination with growing unease. In the week since discovering the crystal sextant's warnings, he had sent messages to every practitioner of oceanic magic in the Atlantic world. Margaret was one of only 3 who had responded, and the only one whose reputation suggested she might actually be able to help. There must be a way to use it safely, he insisted. The Atlanticans wouldn't have created something that was purely destructive, wouldn't they? Margaret's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "From what your monkeys told me about their final days, they were willing to destroy themselves to save the world. This flute was probably meant to be played by someone who accepted death as the price of keeping the barriers strong. Jinx chittered agreement from his perch on Murdoch's shoulder, the silver collar around his neck growing warm in response to the bone flute's presence. The monkey's ancient memories held knowledge of the Atlantecan musicians, artists who had learned to weave magic through sound, creating melodies that could calm hurricanes or songs that could drive sea monsters to madness. "The Song of Binding," Jinx said softly. "That's what this was designed to play. A harmony that resonates across dimensional frequencies, strengthening the barriers between our reality and the spaces where the old ones wait." Margaret nodded grimly, but the song requires 7 different voices, each one pitched to match a different dimensional layer. One human throat can't produce the full harmony without tearing itself apart. They stood on the deck of the Crimson Leviathan, as she rode at anchor near a small island that existed only during certain tidal conditions. Around them the Leviathan fleet had gathered in response to Murdoch's summons, 12 ships crewed by pirates, reformed naval officers, and treasure hunters who had gradually come to understand that their new purpose transcended conventional piracy. But even with all their resources combined, they were facing a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The bone flute could theoretically strengthen dimensional barriers across thousands of miles of ocean, but using it required a sacrifice that would destroy whoever made the attempt. "What about multiple singers?" Murdoch suggested. 7 people, each one responsible for a single frequency. "That might work," Margaret admitted. "If we could find 7 people whose voices naturally resonate with dimensional frequency, and if we could teach them to harmonize perfectly, because even a slight discord would tear holes in reality instead of patching them." Silas McGillicuddy, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, stepped forward with an expression of grim determination. "I'll be one of the 7, he said simply. "My time wearing the crown of Leviathans changed my voice, gave it harmonics that don't a normal human speech. If this is what's needed to make amends for what I nearly caused." Margaret examined him with eyes that could see beyond normal human perception.
"You've got the resonance," she confirmed.
"The crown's corruption left marks on your vocal cords, but they're the kind of marks that might serve a useful purpose for once." Over the next hour they tested other members of the fleet. Old Henrik's replacement as ship's cook turned out to possess a bass voice that vibrated at exactly the right frequency to reinforce reality's foundation. A former Spanish naval officer who had joined them after witnessing dimensional creatures attack his ship could hit notes that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. By evening they had identified 6 potential singers, each one carrying some mark of supernatural encounter that had altered their voice in ways that normal humans couldn't achieve. But they still needed a 7th, someone whose voice could reach the highest frequencies required by the Song of Binding. "I can do it," said a voice from the shadows near the ship's main mast. Everyone turned to stare at the speaker, Thomas Craven's younger brother, Peter, who had joined the fleet after his sibling's death during the mutiny. Peter had barely spoken above a whisper since coming aboard, traumatized by witnessing his brother's transformation and betrayal. "Peter, lad," Margaret said gently, "the highest frequencies are the most dangerous. They're the ones most likely to tear a singer's throat apart." "My brother died serving forces that wanted to destroy everything," Peter replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "If I can die helping to save it, then his death might mean something after all." Margaret tested his voice with a series of increasingly complex vocal exercises, her expression growing more impressed with each attempt. Peter's natural range was exceptional, but more importantly, his grief had given his voice a quality that resonated with the frequency used to mourn dying realities. Exactly what was needed to strengthen barriers that were slowly failing under pressure from cosmic parasites. 7 singers, Margaret said finally, looking at the assembled volunteers. 7 voices that have been changed by encounters with forces beyond human understanding. It's poetic, in a way, using the scars left by supernatural encounters to heal the wounds being inflicted on reality itself. Murdoch held the bone flute up to the starlight, watching how its surface seemed to absorb photons and transform them into something else, sound that existed in dimensions where normal physics held no authority. The artifact was warm to the touch, responding to the presence of voices that could give it proper expression. "How long do we have to learn the Song of Binding?" he asked. "The full harmony," Margaret calculated quickly. "With perfect synchronization across 7-dimensional frequencies, 3 weeks if we're lucky. And that's assuming none of the singer's voices give out under the strain of practice." Practice. Jinx's collar pulsed with gentle warmth, and the monkey chittered a message that made Murdoch's blood turn cold. 35 days until convergence. Old Ones increasing pressure on barriers. Small breaches detected near Bermuda Triangle. They were running out of time faster than expected. The Old Ones weren't waiting for their grand assault. They were accelerating their timeline, taking advantage of every weakness in the dimensional barriers to force their way through incrementally. "Then we start training immediately," Murdoch decided, "and we pray that 3 weeks is enough time to learn a song that was never meant for human voices to sing." The blood compass pointed not toward magnetic north, but toward the nearest source of dimensional instability. Carved from the heartwood of a tree that had grown in soil watered by Atlantecan sacrifice, its needle was suspended in a chamber filled with the crystallized tears of the last sea druids, those who had witnessed their civilization's final moments. Unlike Murdoch's father's compass, which calculated dimensional pathways, this artifact responded to active breaches in reality's fabric. When held steady, its needle would swing toward areas where the Old One's influence was seeping through, allowing the Leviathan fleet to locate and contain dimensional incursions before they could spread. Captain Elena Vasquez, formerly of the Spanish Royal Navy, had brought the compass when she joined the fleet 3 days ago. Her ship, the Santa Isabella, had encountered a breach near the Florida Keys. Her entire crew had been transformed into something that was no longer quite human before she managed to escape, with her life and her sanity barely intact. "The needle started spinning like a dervish the moment we approached your position," she reported, her voice carrying the controlled precision of someone who had seen too much to allow emotion to interfere with duty. "Whatever you're carrying aboard this ship, it's either causing dimensional instability or attracting it." Murdoch examined the blood compass with growing unease. The needle was indeed spinning, but not randomly. It was tracing the same geometric pattern that appeared on Jinx's collar, the same symbols that covered Atlantecan ruins, the same configurations that the crystal sextant showed when mapping dimensional weak points. "It's the artifacts," he realized. "The trident, the conch, all of them together are creating some kind of resonance effect." Margaret O'Malley looked up from her work teaching the 7 singers their dimensional harmonies. "Aye, that makes sense. The Atlanteans never meant for all their major artifacts to be in the same location. They were designed to work across great distances, not concentrated on a single ship." Jinx chittered agreement from his shoulder, the silver collar growing warm with agitation. The monkey's ancient memories held warnings about artifact concentration. Knowledge that combining too many items of power in one location could create unpredictable effects on the fabric of reality itself. "The Old Ones can sense the concentration," Jinx explained. "It's like a beacon drawing their attention to our exact location. Every moment we keep the artifacts together makes us a more attractive target." Elena studied the blood compass readings with professional expertise. "More than that, the resonance effect is weakening dimensional barriers in a sphere around your ship. You're not just attracting the Old One's attention, you're making it easier for them to reach you." The implications were staggering. The Leviathan fleet had gathered its most powerful artifacts in one place to maximize their defensive capabilities, but instead they had created the very weakness their enemies needed to exploit. It was like building a fortress while simultaneously opening gates in its wall. "How long before the effect becomes critical?" Murdoch asked, though he suspected the answer would be unpleasant. Elena held the blood compass steady, watching how its needle moved in response to the artifact's combined presence. "The readings suggest we have maybe 72 hours before the dimensional instability around this ship becomes self-sustaining. After that, the Old Ones won't need to force their way through. Reality will be thin enough here that they can simply step across." Margaret's expression grew grim. "And if we scatter the artifacts to different ships, The resonance effect would diminish, but we'd lose the ability to coordinate their use. The Song of Binding requires all 3 Caribbean artifacts to be present when it's performed, or the harmony won't have enough power to strengthen barriers across the entire region. They were caught in an impossible trap. Keeping the artifacts together made them vulnerable to dimensional incursion, but separating them would eliminate their ability to perform the one ritual that might save the Caribbean from systematic corruption. There's another problem, Elena continued, consulting readings that made the blood compass glow with increasingly urgent light. The dimensional instability isn't just affecting this location. The resonance effect is creating sympathetic vibrations in weak points throughout the region. Every place the Old Ones have previously attempted to breach is becoming more unstable. Murdoch felt the weight of cosmic responsibility crushing down on him, like the pressure of the deepest ocean trenches. Every decision seemed to make the situation worse. Every attempt to strengthen their defenses only created new vulnerabilities for their enemies to exploit. "The Bermuda Triangle breach you mentioned," he said to Jinx. "How bad is it?" The monkey's response was delivered in the rapid chittering that indicated extreme urgency, growing hourly, creatures emerging that predate life on Earth, local wildlife fleeing, military vessels reporting equipment failures and crew disappearances. Elena nodded confirmation. "My contacts in the Naval Intelligence Network report similar incidents across the region. It's as if something is systematically weakening every dimensional barrier the Atlanticans ever established." "Because something is," Margaret said quietly. "The Old Ones aren't just planning one massive assault, they're preparing the battlefield. Every small breach makes the next one easier. Every incursion weakens the barriers for miles around. They're not trying to force their way through strong defenses, they're destroying the defenses first, then walking through the ruins." The blood compass suddenly began spinning violently, its needle tracing patterns that hurt to watch directly. Elena grabbed the artifact to steady it, her face going pale as she read the measurements it was providing. "Something large is moving through dimensional space," she reported, "something that's causing massive instability in the barriers between realities. It's still distant, but it's heading directly toward our position." "How distant?" Murdoch asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the trident of tides. "Based on the resonance patterns, 18 hours, maybe less." Murdoch looked around at his assembled fleet, at the artifacts they had gathered, at the 7 singers still learning harmonies that might save the world if they could master them in time. 18 hours to prepare for an encounter with something that existed partially outside normal reality, while managing dimensional instability that grew stronger with every passing moment. "Signal the fleet," he ordered. "All ships are to maintain maximum distance while staying within communication range. If we can't reduce the artifact's resonance effect, we'll at least minimize how many people are at risk when whatever's coming arrives." The blood compass pulsed with light that seemed to exist in colors beyond the normal spectrum, its readings showing dimensional tears opening like wounds in the fabric of space-time itself. Whatever was approaching had enough power to damage reality by its mere presence, and it was being drawn to their location by the very artifacts they needed to defend against it. As the sun set over waters that rippled with unnatural phosphorescence, Murdoch realized they were about to face their first major test against forces that could reshape the fundamental laws of existence. The question wasn't whether they would survive the encounter, but whether reality itself would remain intact when it was over. The void anchor manifested at the moment when reality around the Crimson Leviathan grew so thin that normal matter began to lose coherence. Unlike the other artifacts, this one hadn't been crafted by Atlantican hands. It was a gift from something that existed in the spaces between dimensions, a tool created by entities that had learned to navigate the void between realities without being consumed by it. The anchor appeared as a sphere of crystallized nothingness, roughly the size of a human head, that seemed to absorb light without reflecting it. When Murdoch first laid eyes on it, floating just above the ship's deck, where it had materialized spontaneously, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. It wasn't black. Black was still a color, still something that existed within the spectrum of normal perception. This was an absence so complete that looking at it directly caused a sensation of falling into infinite emptiness. "Don't touch it," Margaret O'Malley warned as Murdoch reached toward the sphere. That thing exists partially outside our reality. Physical contact might drag you into dimensional space with it. But even as she spoke, they could all feel the void anchor's effect on their surroundings. The dimensional instability that had been building around the concentrated artifacts began to stabilize, as if the sphere was creating a pocket of calm in the storm of reality distortion. "It's buying us time," Elena observed, consulting her blood compass. The needle had stopped its frantic spinning and now pointed steadily toward the approaching entity that still moved through dimensional space, toward their location. Whatever that thing is, it's holding the local space-time fabric together. Jinx chittered nervously from his perch on Murdoch's shoulder, the silver collar around his neck pulsing with frequencies that seemed to harmonize with the void anchor's presence. The monkey's ancient memories held no knowledge of such artifacts. They predated even Atlantecan civilization, created by entities that had existed in the void between realities since the universe began. "The Watchers," Jinx finally said, his voice filled with awe and trepidation. "Beings that exist in the spaces between worlds, observing the interactions between different realities. They're older than the old ones, older than any civilization. They usually don't interfere. But they're interfering now," Murdoch pointed out. "Why?" The answer came not from Jinx, but from the void anchor itself. As they watched, symbols began appearing on its surface, not carved or etched, but formed from the absence of absence, creating patterns visible only because they were slightly less empty than the sphere surrounding them. Margaret squinted at the writing, her knowledge of forbidden languages serving her well. "It's a message. The convergence threatens more than one reality. The old one's hunger would consume infinite worlds. This anchor holds your space stable while you prepare. Use the time wisely." The symbols faded, replaced by new text that made Murdoch's blood turn cold. 15 hours until the herald arrives. 17 hours until the song of binding must be performed. Success or failure determines the fate of all realities that border your own. "Herald?" Elena asked, her naval training making her focus on tactical details. "What's a herald in this context?" Jinx's explanation was delivered in the rapid chittering that indicated extreme danger. "Advance scout for old ones. Tests reality's defenses before main assault. Powerful enough to tear holes in dimensional barriers, just by existing in normal space." The void anchor pulsed with what might have been approval at Jinx's assessment. Around it, the air itself seemed more solid, more real, as if its presence was reinforcing the fundamental laws of physics in their immediate vicinity. "The singers," Margaret said suddenly. "We need to get them practicing with the real harmonies now, while the anchor is stabilizing local reality. If they wait until the herald arrives, the dimensional distortion might make it impossible to achieve proper resonance." Over the next hour, they assembled the 7 singers on the Crimson Leviathan's deck, arranged in a precise geometric pattern around the void anchor. Peter Craven, Silas McGillicuddy, and the 5 others whose voices had been altered by supernatural encounters began the delicate process of learning to harmonize across dimensional frequencies. The void anchor seemed to listen to their practice, its surface occasionally showing new symbols that corrected their pitch or timing. It was as if the artifact contained the accumulated knowledge of entities that had heard the song of binding performed correctly, and was sharing that expertise to ensure the current attempt would succeed. "The harmony is more complex than we thought," Margaret reported after the first hour of practice. "The singers aren't just producing sound in our reality, they're creating vibrations that extend into adjacent dimensions. The void anchor is showing them how to modulate their voices to reach frequency ranges that don't normally exist in our space-time, but learning to sing in multiple dimensions simultaneously was taking its toll on the performers." Peter's voice, responsible for the highest frequencies, began to show signs of strain after just 30 minutes. Silas fared better, his previous exposure to the crown of Leviathans having prepared his vocal cords for unnatural stresses, but even he was struggling with the more complex harmonic progressions. "Will they be ready in time?" Murdoch, watching blood begin to trickle from Peter's nose as he attempted a particularly challenging passage. "They have to be," Margaret replied grimly, "because if they're not, The herald's arrival will destabilize local reality enough to make the song impossible to perform. And without the song to strengthen dimensional barriers, the old ones will have clear passage into our world. The void anchor pulsed once more, displaying a final message that chilled everyone who read it. The Watchers can provide stability and knowledge, but cannot fight your battle. The choice between salvation and damnation remains yours alone. As the artifact's message faded, Murdoch could feel the approaching herald's presence like a cold weight pressing against the edges of consciousness. Something vast and alien was moving through dimensional space toward their location, something that existed partially outside the normal laws of physics. Elena's blood compass began showing readings that defied interpretation, needle movements that suggested the approaching entity was simultaneously in multiple locations, existing across several dimensional layers at once. Whatever was coming wasn't just powerful, it was a creature that experienced reality in ways that human minds couldn't fully comprehend. 14 hours, Murdoch announced to his assembled fleet. 14 hours to master harmonies that were never meant for human voices, while preparing to face something that might not be entirely defeatable through conventional means. The void anchor continued its silent vigil, holding local reality stable while cosmic forces gathered for a confrontation that would determine whether the Caribbean, and perhaps the entire world, would remain a place where human civilization could exist. Around them, the 7 singers continued their practice, their voices growing stronger and more synchronized with each attempt, while the void anchor provided guidance from entities older than time itself. The shield of echoes materialized just as the herald's presence began tearing holes in the Caribbean sky. Woven from crystallized sound waves that had traveled across the universe since its birth, the artifact appeared as a disk of translucent material that seemed to contain the visual impression of every song that had ever been sung, every word that had ever been spoken, every scream that had ever echoed across the cosmos. Margaret O'Malley caught the shield as it fell from empty air, her weathered hands immediately recognizing the power contained within its seemingly fragile structure. Unlike the void anchor, which had arrived as a gift from mysterious watchers, this artifact emerged from the collective will of reality itself, the universe's own defense mechanism responding to a threat that could unravel the fundamental laws of existence. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered, watching patterns of light and shadow dance across the shield's surface, like looking at the visual representation of music itself. But Murdoch could see beyond the artifact's aesthetic appeal to its true purpose. The Shield of Echoes wasn't just a defensive tool, it was a repository of every protective harmony that had ever been sung, every word of power that had ever been spoken to hold back chaos and entropy. When held properly, it could amplify the song of binding beyond anything 7 human voices could achieve alone. "The universe is trying to help us," he realized, feeling the shield's resonance, with the bone flute and the 7 singers still practicing their dimensional harmonies. Reality itself doesn't want the old ones to break through. Above them, the herald's arrival had begun in earnest. The sky was cracking like broken glass, revealing glimpses of dimensional spaces where physics followed different rules, and light behaved in ways that made the human mind recoil. Through these cracks came sounds that belonged to no earthly creature, whispers in languages that predated the formation of planets, songs that described the deaths of stars, harmonies that celebrated the consumption of entire realities. The herald itself was still largely invisible, existing primarily in dimensions adjacent to normal space-time, but its influence was unmistakable. The sea around the Leviathan fleet began to churn with unnatural phosphorescence, and creatures from the deepest trenches began rising to the surface, not swimming upward, but being pulled into reality from spaces that existed between the ocean's layers. "How long can the void anchor hold local reality stable?" Murdoch asked, watching the crystalline sphere pulse with increasing urgency as it struggled to maintain coherence in the face of the herald's reality-warping presence. "Not long enough for the singers to master the full song of binding," Margaret replied, hefting the Shield of Echoes experimentally. "But maybe long enough if we can use this to amplify what they've already learned." The shield responded to her touch by displaying visual representations of the 7 singers' progress. Each voice appeared as a different colored stream of light, flowing across the artifact's surface, and where the streams intersected, new patterns emerged. harmonies more complex than anything the individual singers could produce alone. It's showing us the completed song Margaret breathed, not just the parts we've been practicing, but the full harmonic structure as it was meant to be performed. Jinx chittered urgently from Murdoch's shoulder, the silver collar around his neck now glowing bright enough to cast shadows in the herald's eldritch light. The monkey's ancient memories we were providing crucial context. Shield contains echoes of every time song was successfully performed. Can project missing harmonies to complete the binding. But even as they discovered this potential solution, the herald's presence was growing stronger. Reality cracks spread across the sky like a spider web, and through them came glimpses of the old ones themselves, entities so vast and alien that perceiving them directly caused physical pain. Tentacles the size of storm clouds pressed against dimensional barriers, testing their strength, while eyes that contained the light of dying galaxies searched for weak points to exploit. The singers, Elena called out, consulting her blood compass as its needle spun wildly in response to cascading dimensional instability. They need to begin the song now before the herald's presence makes it impossible to achieve proper resonance. The 7 voices took their positions around the void anchor, with Margaret holding the shield of echoes at the formation's center. As they began to sing, the shield responded by projecting the missing harmonies, not as sound that could be heard, but as vibrations that existed in the spaces between normal frequencies. Peter Craven's voice, reaching for notes that barely existed in human perception, was suddenly supported by echoes of every high note that had ever been sung to hold back chaos. Silas McGillicuddy's bass tones gained depth from the resonance of every protective chant that had ever been spoken to strengthen reality's foundations. The Song of Binding began to take shape, its 7-part harmony creating patterns of sound that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions. But the herald was fighting back, its presence warping space-time in ways that made it increasingly difficult for the singers to maintain their coordination. "The shield is working," Margaret reported, watching as the artifact absorbed the herald's disruptive influence and converted it into supportive harmonies. "But the strain is enormous. I don't know how long it can maintain this level of amplification." Through the reality cracks, more of the old ones were becoming visible. Murdoch could see entities that existed as living contradictions, creatures that were simultaneously solid and gaseous, finite and infinite, beautiful and terrifyingly alien. They pressed against the dimensional barriers with increasing urgency, sensing that the thaw of binding was beginning to strengthen the very walls that held them imprisoned. The herald's response was swift and desperate. Instead of trying to break through the barriers directly, it began attacking the singers themselves, sending tendrils of reality distortion toward the 7 humans whose voices were creating the dimensional locks that would seal the old ones away for another millennium. "Protect the singers," Murdoch shouted, raising the trident of tides to create barriers of crystallized water around the formation. But even as he moved to defend them, he could see that the herald's assault was too complex for purely physical protection. The shield of echoes pulsed once more, displaying a message written in harmonics that only Margaret could interpret. The song must be completed within the next 60 seconds, or the dimensional resonance will collapse entirely. After that, nothing in this reality will be strong enough to hold back the old one's assault. 60 seconds to save not just the Caribbean, but every ocean on Earth from corruption that would transform the planet into something that existed only to feed cosmic parasites. The 7 singers pushed their voices beyond human limits, supported by echoes of every protective harmony that had ever been sung, while reality itself bent and twisted around them in response to forces that predated the formation of matter itself. As the final notes of the Song of Binding began to take shape, Murdoch realized that success would require one more sacrifice. Someone would need to hold the shield of echoes steady while the dimensional locks engaged, even though doing so would expose them to energies that could erase their existence from multiple realities simultaneously. The final lock manifested not as a physical object, but as a concept made tangible, the crystallized intention of every guardian who had ever chosen duty over personal desire. It appeared in Murdoch's hands as the song of binding reached its crescendo, taking the form of a key carved from compressed starlight and tempered with the sacrifice of countless protectors who had come before. This was the artifact that would either seal the Old Ones away for another 1,000 years or fail catastrophically, allowing cosmic parasites to pour into reality like a tide of devouring darkness. Unlike the other relics they had gathered, the final lock existed only in the moment of ultimate choice. It could not be prepared for, practiced with, or understood in advance. It simply was, when the need for it became absolute. The key to all locks, Jinx whispered. His voice filled with awe as ancient memories provided context for what they were witnessing. The Atlanticans wrote about it in their most sacred texts, but none of them ever saw it manifest. It appears only when someone is willing to lock away ultimate power forever. Margaret O'Malley held the shield of echoes steady as the 7 singers pushed their voices to frequencies that existed beyond human capability, their harmony creating dimensional locks that snapped into place around the Old One's prison, like bars forged from crystallized reality. But the Herald was fighting desperately now, its presence warping space-time so violently that maintaining the song's structure required constant adjustment. "Murdoch!" Elena shouted over the sound of dimensions grinding against each other. "The blood compass is showing massive instability. The barriers are holding, but barely." The final lock grew heavier in Murdoch's hands as its purpose became clear. To use it properly, he would need to combine it with all 3 of the Caribbean artifacts, the Trident of Tides, the Storm Collar's conch, and the Eye of the Serpent. But doing so would transform the lock into something permanent, sealing away not just the Old Ones, but also the power that had made him guardian of the oceans. "You understand what this means," the final lock whispered in his mind, its voice the accumulated wisdom of every protector who had ever made the ultimate sacrifice. "Using me will close the dimensional pathways forever. The Old Ones will be trapped, but so will the power that flows through the artifacts. You'll return to being simply human." Murdoch looked around at the chaos surrounding them, reality cracking like broken glass, the Herald's tentacles reaching through dimensional rifts, the Old Ones pressing against barriers that wouldn't hold much longer without permanent reinforcement. His choice was clear: remain a guardian with power over the oceans, but risk the barriers eventually failing, or sacrifice that power to ensure the Old Ones could never threaten reality again. "The song is reaching critical resonance," Margaret called out, the shield of echoes blazing with harmonies from across the universe. "Whatever you're going to do, it has to be now." Murdoch raised the final lock, feeling its weight multiply as it absorbed power from the Trident, the conch, and the Eye. The 3 artifacts that had made him more than human began to dim, their energy flowing into the key that would seal away cosmic horror forever. But even as he prepared to use the final lock, something unexpected happened. The silver collar around Jinx's neck began to glow with the same light as the key, and the monkey spoke words that changed everything. "Wait," Jinx said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the song of binding itself. "There's another one. The collar contains the essence of every guardian who has ever served. If I merge with the final lock, the seal can be maintained without requiring your sacrifice." The offer was staggering in its implication. Jinx was proposing to become the lock itself, transforming from a living being into a permanent barrier between realities. He would exist forever, as pure intention, holding back the Old Ones through will alone. "No," Murdoch said immediately, "I won't let you. This was always my purpose." Jinx interrupted gently, "For 10 years I've been preparing you to make this choice. But now I see that the choice was never yours to make. It was mine." The monkey leaped from Murdoch's shoulder toward the final lock, and the moment he made contact with the crystallized starlight, both he and the key began to transform. The silver collar expanded, its ancient symbols spreading across Jinx's form until he became something more than physical, a conscious barrier between dimensions, powered by the accumulated loyalty of centuries. The song of binding reached its final note just as Jinx completed his transformation. The 7 singers collapsed from exhaustion, but their voices had done their work. Dimensional barriers snapped into place around the Old One's prison, reinforced by the permanent presence of a guardian who would never tire, never falter, never forget his duty. The Herald's presence began to fade immediately, its connection to the Old One severed by locks that could not be broken. Reality reasserted itself around the Leviathan fleet, the sky healing like a wound, closing, the sea returning to its natural color and movement. "It's over," Margaret breathed, letting the shield of echoes dissolve back into constituent sound waves. "The barriers will hold for 1,000 years, maybe more." But Murdoch felt no triumph, only loss. Jinx was gone, transformed into something that existed to protect reality itself. The final lock had claimed the one companion who had shared his journey from beginning to end. Then he heard it. A familiar chittering, barely audible but unmistakably present. The final lock hadn't consumed Jinx entirely. Something of the monkey's consciousness remained, woven into the dimensional barriers themselves. "I'm still here," came the whisper, carried on currents that existed between realities. "Just different. The conversation isn't ending, Captain. It's just moving to a frequency you'll need to learn to hear." Murdoch smiled, understanding finally that some partnerships transcend physical form. The bond between guardian and guide had evolved into something that would endure as long as the barriers held, protecting not just the Caribbean but every reality that bordered their own. The final lock had sealed away ultimate power, but it had also preserved something even more valuable: the friendship between a giant pirate and a small monkey who had saved the world by finally understanding each other completely.